consumption. So our Torah reading. Who's that?
It's Meryl. My dog has something to say.
All right. Well, I thought maybe your dog saw some Amazon delivery man or something like that. So, okay. Our Torah portion is a double Torah portion, but the two Torah portions on their own are very, very short. We're coming to the very end of the Torah, and the two Torah portions are Nitzavim-Vayeilech. So they begin on page 1165 in the Eitz Chaim Chumash. This is Deuteronomy chapter 29, starting with verse 9. And we only have a couple of chapters left in the whole book of Deuteronomy. So we've got these two Torah portions, Nitzavim and Vayeilech, for this Shabbat. Then we take a break because we have Rosh Hashanah on Shabbat, so we don't have a weekly Torah portion. Then we have Shabbat Shuvah, the Shabbat between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So that will be Ha'azinu. That'll be the next Torah portion after Nitzavim and Vayeilech. And then, which is chapter 32 of Deuteronomy. So we're at 29 and 30 and 31. We'll do this Shabbat. Then we have Ha'azinu. And then the only Torah portion that we don't read on a Shabbat is Vezot HaBracha, which is read on Simchas Torah. But of course, this Simchas Torah is also, like all of our Shabbatot and holidays, going to be a strange experience, not the usual experience. Anyway, so the Torah portions, Nitzavim and Vayeilech, well, half the time they're together, half the time they're separate, or maybe a little more than half the time they're together. I'm hearing a little echoing or something. Maybe somebody can mute. This is really the last moments, the last day in the tradition. This is the last day of Moses' life, and this is his, tying loose ends together. So he has a burst of rhetorical speech in Nitzavim, and then Vayeilech means and he went. So theoretically he finished talking, but then he doesn't quite finish talking. But he goes off, and instead of making a public speech with all of Israel listening, gathered around and listening to him, the presentation is that he actually then goes off and tries to make a little farewell tour, tent by tent or tribe by tribe, and he's going around to the instead of them coming to him, he's going around circulating among the people and telling them, my end is near. I can't be your leader anymore. And we have the handing off of the leadership to Joshua, as we've already been prepared to know about. He's the designated heir. And we have more warnings and exhortations by Moses. So that's what's happening. There's not in Vayeilech, or is it? Yeah, it's in Vayeilech. We get the last two commandments of the 613 commandments. One commandment is a public reading of the Torah is commanded every 7 years. After the sabbatical year, the Shemitah year, is observed. So we remember, hopefully, that there's a cycle agriculturally of 6 years of working the land, and there are various ways that we help the poor people or help other people during those 6 years. There's a 3-year cycle that repeats, 2 3-year cycles. Then the 7th year is the sabbatical year. We don't work the land anymore. And then right after the sabbatical year is over, at Sukkot, the Torah commands that everybody is already at the central shrine. This is a pilgrimage holiday where everybody is supposed to come to the same one place to greet God. And when they finish that, they're supposed to hear from the leader of the people a public reading of the Torah. And that is the beginning of the development of the system that we have of public Torah reading that became eventually the system that we have of weekly Torah readings on Shabbat, twice on Shabbat, actually, theoretically, traditionally once in the morning and then once in the Mincha afternoon service, and then on Monday and Thursday. So those were all instituted later by the people, by the rabbis, but the Torah itself mandates this not once a year, but once every 7 years. And the last mitzvah of the Torah is to write. Each Israelite is commanded to write a Torah for themselves. So in communities, this has often been done, since most of us are not capable of being a Torah scribe. Most of us can, however, discharge the mitzvah by supporting the writing of a Torah. A lot of times, communities sponsor the writing of a Torah. There was a centennial Torah that was written and acquired by Shomrei when Shomrei was 100 years old in 2005. So, and then by participating and supporting that, you're fulfilling that mitzvah. And then the tradition says, but what this really is about spreading Torah. It's about making sure that everybody is connected to the Torah. So the idea of acquiring a Jewish library is part of the fulfillment of this mitzvah. So just, in this time of the pandemic, we have discovered that a lot of people have taken it for granted that they don't really need to have Jewish books in their home because they'll come to synagogue and the Jewish books are in the synagogue. Well, now you can't come to the synagogue. So where are the Jewish books? In the old days, everybody had their own Jewish books. Everybody had their own prayer book. Everybody had their own High Holiday Machzor. Everybody had their own Bible, their own Chumash, their own Tanakh. People had these basic books. And then, of course, if you were more learned, you tried to get other books and so on. And we were called the people of the book, not simply because we sanctified the book, but because literacy and the preciousness of the book were qualities that were very, very widespread in the Jewish community. So now we notice all of a sudden, wait, this household, or that household doesn't have a prayer book. So we start making PDFs, we start making, links. We're doing something really important for the high holidays. People have asked to borrow a machzor from the shul. So we went through a whole process of numbering the machzors, and we're going to be, distributing them on Sunday and on Wednesday for people who need them. And we hope that people are going to give them back because they cost, they cost money when you're not buying one machzor. When you're buying hundreds of machzors for a shul, that's an outlay that's serious. So we hope people will return the machzors, but we also recognize that it's a big mitzvah to have that machzor in your hand. So we're happy to help out. But ultimately, what the Torah says is, this is not a luxury item. This is a necessity. You have to buy a quart of milk every week. You have to have a book of the Torah in your house. You have to have a prayer book in your house. So that's my little plug that people should do the best that they can to actually acquire their own personal books. And then those books accrue all kinds of histories, right? They accrue sentimental value. They accrue a kind of a patina of sweetness, because it was a book that was part of your experience, part of your family's experience. And that's really important for creating tradition. So finding something, an edition that speaks to you, a book that has a beautiful cover, or making a beautiful cover for it. All of these things are part of the enhancement of this mitzvah of make a personal connection with the Torah. All right, so all of this is all introductory sermonizing. before we get to the to study a little bit of text. Does anybody have a particular part of the Torah reading that they want to look at? Going once, going twice.
There were two things that stood out to me.
Uh-oh.
No,
I'm just kidding. I appreciate it.
just the two quick things there, right before verse 30. So it's not book 30. So it's
Right
29, chapter 29,
30.
verse 28. Chapter 29, verse 28.
Yes.
Concealed acts concern the Lord our God, but with
Right.
overt acts, it is for us and our children ever to apply all the provisions of his teaching. It just reminds me of the Yom Kippur liturgy where God cannot forgive what you do, the transgressions against human to human. God can only forgive your own transgressions against him. In order to be forgiven for wrongs against fellow human beings, you have to do it yourself. So it just reminded me of that.
Right. So you're going super fast on that. So there's so much
Okay.
more to elaborate on that. But okay, what's the second one?
And the second one was chapter 30, verse 6. Then the Lord your God will open up your heart and the hearts of your offspring to love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul, implying that God has to allow you to do it, which reminded me in mirror image of the Pharaoh. He hardened Pharaoh's heart. So like Pharaoh is sort of convinced by Moses, okay, I'll let your people go in Exodus, and then God hardens his heart. So it's sort of a mirror image to me of those two things. Those were the two things that stood out for me.
Okay. So, all right, let's take a vote, a different kind of vote. Between those two things, do we want to take the first one and spend some time on it first, or do we want to take the second one and spend some time on it first? Let's have a show of hands. How many people vote for the first one? How many people vote for the second one? You're voting twice? Is that what the two fingers means twice? Yeah. Peace, brother.
Number 2.
Okay, so there you go. All right, so by a narrow margin, the vote seems to have been carried, although it may be rigged. This may be a rigged election, and I don't know. But by a narrow margin, it means that we're going to look at the second of the two things that you pointed out. But they're both very, very worthy of looking at, and maybe we'll end up figuring out a way to connect them both together. Let's where should we start? Let's start though from the beginning of chapter 30. Okay, the beginning of chapter 30 to give us a little bit of a background for what's going on here. And this is a very, very important section to look at. Again, Deuteronomy chapter 30, if you don't have the Eitz Chaim. If you have the Eitz Chaim, it's page 1169. Okay, and Lynn, since you're the instigator here.
As usual, you want me to read?
Please.
Okay. When all these things befall you, the blessing and the curse that I have set before you, and you take them to heart amidst the various nations to which the Lord your God has banished you, and you return to the Lord your God, and you and your children heed his command with all your heart and soul, just as I enjoin upon you this day, then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes and take you back in love. He will bring you together again from all the peoples where the Lord your God has scattered you. Even if your outcasts are at the end of the world, from there the Lord your God will gather you, from there he will fetch you, and the Lord your God will bring you to the land that your fathers possessed, and you shall possess it, and he will make you more prosperous and more numerous than your fathers. Then the Lord your God will open up your heart and the hearts of your offspring to love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul, in order that you may live. The Lord your God will inflict all those curses upon the enemies and foes who persecuted you. You, however, will again heed the Lord and obey all his commandments that I enjoin upon you this day. And the Lord your God will grant you abounding prosperity in all your undertakings, in the issue of your womb, the offspring of your cattle, and the produce of your soil. For the Lord will again delight in your well-being, as he did in that of your fathers, since you will be heeding the Lord your God and keeping his commandments and laws that are recorded in this book of the teaching, once you return to the Lord your God with all your heart and soul.
Okay. And then the next piece is the piece that I spoke about in the Torah Sparks, if you got a chance to look at that.
Yeah.
So this section, this is a freestanding section in the Torah. If you look at a Hebrew edition in the Eitz Chaim, for instance, on page 1170, after what you just read, there's a pei, a letter pei, which means that this is an open line in the Torah. There's no more words written on that line, and the next words have to be written as a separate paragraph. So this is considered a freestanding section. This section is called Parashat HaTshuva, the section about repentance, about return. In the Hebrew, it's a little more clear than in the English. There's an echoing, there's a drumbeat of repetition of a motif of the word to return. Right. So if you look at it in the Hebrew, it starts with the first verse, etc., etc. V'hashevota el levavecha. Then the next verse, v'shavta ad Hashem Elokecha. Then the next verse, v'shav Hashem Elokecha et shvutcha, v'shav v'kibetzcha, etc., etc. And then we have the next one is in verse 8. V'ata tashuv v'shamata b'kol Hashem, etc. And then again in verse 9. Ki yashuv Hashem lasus alecha latov kasher sas alavotecha, etc., etc., etc. And then the last verse 10, Ki tashuv el Hashem Elokecha l'chol levavcha v'chol nafshecha. So just, you don't have to understand Hebrew, just understand this. V'shav, v'shuv, tashuv, v'shav, shvutcha, v'shivcha, hashevota. It's this word that means to return, to come back, to restore. And it's considered to be there 7 times, the magic Jewish number, right? This is meant to be a unit that is a distillation of the idea of tshuva. And this was actually coordinated in our system of Torah reading to be read either right before Rosh Hashanah or right before Yom Kippur, depending on whether these 2 Torah readings are combined or separate. If they're combined, so then we're reading it right now before Rosh Hashanah when we're supposed to be, returning to God. When there's the quirk of the Jewish calendar works out that we need an extra Shabbat, then we split these 2 Torah readings, and then this Torah reading, this Torah reading is always read before Shabbat, before Rosh Hashanah. Vayeilech is read on Shabbat Shuvah. So this is always read right before Rosh Hashanah. And this is about this idea of spiritual restoration, physical restoration. So let's now get to the point that you were bringing up, the heart. So I mentioned already while we were studying Devarim, I've mentioned it in different times, different places. Devarim is, from my perspective, not so special because of the uniqueness of the fact that it insists you can only worship God in one place. That's like one of the big scholarship points, that the Deuteronomic school is insisting that you can only worship God in one place. I mean, that's true. But to me, one of the most special qualities of the book of Deuteronomy is the discovery of the heart. To make the heart a persistent, central focus of everything that is being said. So famously, we have, of course, the Shema. And that's where we have a phrase that here gets repeated a few times, right? With all your heart and with all your soul. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul. So Lynn rightly points out that the association that you made was with Pharaoh. And the truth of the matter is that when we read the Torah from the beginning, starting from, and soon we'll start all over again, starting from Genesis 1:1, as you go through the Torah, the heart does not do so well. The first time we have mentioned focus on the heart is that God is heartsick over how evil the human heart is. And God decides to make a flood come to the world. So the beginning of our introduction to the whole concept of the heart as a place of feeling and contemplation and considering life, it's all depressing. The human heart is labeled as a bad thing. The person, Yetzer Lev Ha'adam Rak Ra Minurav. From the get-go, human beings, their heart is just always wanting to do evil. Then we get to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh is the exemplar of the hard heart. So even though it's famous that God hardens Pharaoh's heart, it's a whole complicated story, and we've looked at that many times. But it starts with Pharaoh hardening his own heart. And that's important to remember. So when Pharaoh constantly refuses, first of all, Pharaoh just adopts evil, hard-hearted policies. He wants to oppress an entire people. He wants to murder their children. This is Pharaoh before God comes into the picture. And then when the plagues come in, he's stubborn and he's hard-hearted and so on. So the introduction we have about the heart from the beginning of the Torah through the Exodus story is terrible. It's all the dark side of the human heart. Then we get one glimmer of a different possibility. Does anybody remember where we get, before we get to Deuteronomy, where do we get some glimmer of the fact that the human heart actually could be good? It's not in any of the Genesis stories, but it happens in Exodus, in the book of Exodus. When we, out of our own heart, contribute to making a temple, to making a tabernacle. Kol asher yidvenu libo. Anyone who has a generous heart contributes to the temple. And then, kol chachmat lev. Anyone who has a wisdom in their heart to be able to spin, the women can do this stuff, and the metal workers and so on. All of that comes out of the heart. So what we have actually is a redemption of the human heart in the Jewish story by this idea of taking my heart and being generous and giving and creative for the sake of serving a God that took me out of a house of bondage that was created by the darkness, the blackness of the human heart. So that's the response. After that, we have very little heart discussion. In the sacrifices, again, it comes up that a person may want to give a sacrifice, but the heart really then disappears from the Torah. Moses brings it back, and Moses now says, we had a horrific experience of what the human heart can do, the damage that the human heart can bring. We also had a one-time wonderful flourishing of our own human heart to make a tabernacle. But all of that is in the past, and all of that is limited. The book of Deuteronomy says, now start using your heart every day, all the time. Not just for some special emergency or some special project, but use your heart constantly and use all of it. And love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. So that's not just the human heart, though. It's also the divine heart. Divine heart is also beating and caring for the human being. So when we come back into this portion again focuses on what is the human heart capable of. And the choice has been given to us, as mentioned already. We have a bracha and a klala. You've got blessings or curses. Later on it says, "Avacharta b'chaim," choose life. You can choose either life or death. It's up to you. Choose the life, choose the blessing. So how does that choosing happen? It has to do with according to how you incline your heart. So let's look, before we get to your verse that you singled out, let's look at the first verse again. First verse of chapter 30.
When all these things befall you, the blessing and the curse that I have set before you, and you take them to heart amidst the various nations to which the Lord your God has banished you, and you return to the Lord your God, and you and your children heed his command with all your heart and soul, just as I enjoin upon you this day, then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes and take you back in love.
Okay, so that's already a couple of verses. That's 2.5 verses you did. Okay, but let's look at the first verse again. So when all of these things happen, you're going to learn your lesson, because if you choose blessing, if you choose life, you'll prosper. If you don't choose life, you don't choose blessing, you don't choose serving God, then you're going to get the curse, and you'll endure all kinds of pain and exile, right? The Lord will have banished you to all kinds of places, and then you're going to try to learn the lesson. And then we have the phrase in that first verse, you take to heart amidst the various nations to which the Lord your God has banished you, you will take to heart these lessons. So v'hashevota el levavecha is that you will keep on putting it back into your heart. You know, the translation in the English doesn't even sort of give us the full reality of it, which is it left your heart. You know, you're in the middle of suffering, disaster, or you've run after all kinds of things that you thought were good for you, but now you're going to bring this. Literally, it means bring that back into your heart, right? So the returning is not just I return to God. You have to return certain things that left your heart, that have been emptied out of your heart. You have to return them into your heart. Bring them back into your heart. So this is an action that is done by you, right? That's an action that you accomplish on your own, right? So then we have all these other things. God responds to your taking this back into your heart. And now we come to what you said, right? Verse 6.
Rabbi, before we get to verse 6, the second part of verse 3,
Yeah.
where he will bring you together from all the peoples with the God your Lord has scattered you. There's overtones of messianic.
What Messiah? What about it?
Well, the whole concept of the Messiah bringing everybody back together. Kind of when I heard Lynn read it the first time, that was kind of my first instinct in
Right.
terms of the message there. I don't want to take away from where you were going, but I also don't want to lose that.
Right. So the idea of God returning all of us is a promise, and then how we view that promise changes over time, because we don't have, for instance, after the Babylonian exile, God's promise to bring us back to the land is fulfilled 70 years later. Right? And so even though Cyrus is called by Yeshaya a Messiah, but he's not this classic Jewish Messiah that brings us back to the land and at the end of time and so on. We end up coming back and starting all over again. And that's God has been good to good to God's word. God has brought us back. So it doesn't have the same end of time and end of Mashiach Zeiten, the messianic time. It doesn't have that meaning yet. The Messiah takes on that aura that we have inherited only because the second temple, when it's destroyed, we don't go back after 70 years. We don't go back after 170 years. We don't go back after 700 years. We don't go back after 1,000 years. The ongoing torture of when is God going to fulfill that promise then has to become given a mythic aura of the Messiah. But it's not in this text yet. It's not in this text yet. In this text, it could be done in a minute, next year, without any apocalyptic kind of trappings. All right, so coming back to this, okay? Alan, yes?
Yeah, let's go.
Good. So now let's go to verse 6, the one that you broached before.
Then the Lord your God will open up your heart and the hearts of your offspring to love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul, in order that you may live.
Okay, so now the translation is a little bit poetic, or a little bit, what can I say, cheating. And I'm looking for another verse here for a second. Yeah. So the words in Hebrew, the word in English is, and God will open up your heart. The words in Hebrew are a little more physical. The first word in the verse is Umal Hashem Elokecha et levavcha. God will circumcise your heart. Okay, so it's taking the heart as a piece of flesh and using the kind of verb that we talk about with regard to a brit milah, right? The regular circumcision, where we take the male member and we slice off a piece of it. We slice off the outside covering membrane, right? So that's where we get the opening, but it's actually a very fleshly, literally a very fleshly idea that there's this extra covering of flesh that is not allowing stuff to get into our heart. Remember what we said at the beginning, we have to bring stuff back into our heart. Well, no, our heart has been thickened or hardened by these, scars, or by just the thick skinness of what we've developed for ourselves, not to let the message come in. And now God will circumcise our hearts and the hearts of our children so that we can love God with all of our heart and with all of our soul for the sake of our life, so that you may live. Right? Now, we have another paradox here, right? We can love God with all of our heart only if we chop off a piece of our heart. Right? We have to cut off a piece of our heart so that we can love God with all of our heart. Yeah, Lynn.
Well, you brought up the Brit Milah. I mean, it sounds to me more like a marking, like God is claiming us by marking us, even though it's internal, so that we have to return, we have to do the work, we have to listen to the laws and follow, pledge ourselves. And once we do that, then he will claim us. Is that?
Excellent. So you're taking that beyond the physical act of the circumcision. What's the purpose of the second circumcision? The act of the cutting creates a mark. Correct. Beautiful. So, and that mark is the mark of our connection to God. Part of a covenant, right? Part of not the cutting, but the pact, the brit as a covenant, a relationship. Very, very good. So that's where God can come back into our hearts if we do some of that work. So I want to pursue that a little bit more. And if we look at Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 16. Okay, and this is on page 1049 in Eitz Chaim.
Cut away, therefore, the thickening about your hearts and stiffen your necks no more.
Okay, that's enough.
Yeah.
I mean, and therefore, okay, do one more. Go ahead. Go do another thing.
For the Lord your God is God supreme and Lord supreme, the great, the mighty, and the awesome God, who shows no favor and takes no bribe, but upholds the cause of the fatherless and the widow, and befriends the stranger, providing him with food and clothing. You too must befriend the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt.
Right, and then it goes on, revering God and loving God and so on. So I chose to highlight that verse. What's the connection between that verse, specifically verse 16, right? That's at 16, and verse over there in chapter 10, and now verse 6 in chapter 30.
Hearts are circumcised.
Who's doing the circumcising?
Let's
Who's
see.
the Moel?
Humaltem, you shall circumcise your own heart.
Right. In chapter 10, we are called upon to cut away, literally. There they take the translation and they use it straight in a straightforward way. The same word, right? You should circumcise the orla, the covering membrane of your heart. Right? The word is the same word that's used for the membrane that covers the tip of the penis. And here it says your heart has this. Your heart has a membrane like that, which of course it doesn't. But this is all symbolic, metaphorical, right? And what follows? What if we cut away that thick membrane that is suffocating our heart? What will then happen? We will be able to act just like God.
Mm.
And what does God do in this description? What's the description that we have of God in verses 17 and 18 and 19?
Shows no favor, takes no bribe, upholds the cause of fatherless, the widow, befriends the stranger.
Right. So it's all about social justice. It's
Mm.
all about honesty and taking care of the needy.
Mm.
And this is used as the description of God, who is Hakel, Hagadol, Hagibor, Vahanorah. Those words are the words that we adopted as the way to describe God in our Amidah. When we stand before God, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu Elokei Avoteinu, etc., Hakel, Hagadol, Hagibor, Vehanorah. That's right from this text. It's right from this verse. God is so awesome. God is so amazing. What's so amazing about God? Well, in the next bracha, we say, Somech noflim verofei cholim umatir asurim. Ata gibor. What's this greatness about you? How mighty are you? You take care of people who have stumbled, who have fallen down, who are in captivity. What?
No, I said imprisoned.
Imprisoned, right? So this is God's greatness, right? Not that God made the Himalayas or God, that's like, trivial. God can do that, in a second. God's strength is actually in standing up for people who need God, who need to be protected from the hard-heartedness, the bad-heartedness of the human being. Get rid of that, says the Torah, so that you can then have this connection with God and act in the same way as God. Love the stranger. You know what it means to be abused by a person with a hard heart. You know what it means to be under Pharaoh's heel. So now do it. So, but what we have there in chapter 10 is that we have to do the work. And now in chapter 30, we get this next step. Right? The next step is that then God can come in. Then God can have free entry into our hearts. And like Lynn is saying, and then God can make an imprint on our hearts. If we don't let God in, then God will never be able to make that impression. And I mean literally an impression, right? To impress, to make a mark. I've said this so many times. The Kotzker Rebbe once asked his students, and he only had the top students, he only allowed the top people to be his students. He said, "Where is God?" And they thought it was just a childish question. And they said, "What do you mean, where's God? God is everywhere." And the Kotzker said, "No, God is only where you let God in. If you don't let God in, God is nowhere." So this is part of what this tshuva, a paragraph, this parasha, is all about. And we put it back on God sometimes. We say, Hashivenu Hashem Elecha V'nashuva. It's almost like we're bargaining with God a little bit. If you bring us back, then we'll do tshuva. Then we'll come back. Right? So it's but actually the shoe is on the other foot. V'hashevota el levavecha. First, we have to cut off the thickness of our hearts. We have to bring back into our hearts the arguments that can soften our hearts and can learn the lessons from what it means to live in the hard world that is out there. And then God is able to come back in. Now, of course, it's not only one way or not the other way. There's a constant, reciprocal dynamic going on. But that's when we reach out to God and say, Hashivenu Hashem Elecha. Hashivenu Adonai Elecha v'nash Chadesh Yameinu. Right? When we say Hashivenu, we're going to say it so many times on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So let's actually ask ourselves, what do we mean by that? When we say, God, bring us back, what's God supposed? What could God possibly do that would bring us back? What are we praying for?
We want to come back to His good graces. We want our pleas of penance to be accepted, so that we can come back to His good graces and we can benefit from the promises that He's
so good. So then our prayer should be, Hashem nashuva elecha kabel et tshuvatenu. God, we want to come back to you. Please accept our return. But what does hashivenu then mean? Is that what it means? It means bring us back, means accept our tshuva. But it says, the verse says, hashivenu v'nashuva. Return us, and we will return.
But this is saying the opposite, isn't it? This we have to do the work, and then He will.
That's what I'm asking. Doesn't that seem to, be more, reasonable?
But it's interesting in this verse. It's God who's making the impression.
So God is making that impression. But what I argued before is it's after v'hashevota el levavecha.
Right.
So, and it's after chapter 10. Chapter 30 comes after chapter 10, usually. So, but of course, ein mukdam u'muchar b'Torah. There is no chronological order in the Torah, so that's not a very good argument. But
no, even here, it's saying that you're returning to the Lord, and then He'll impress the mouth.
Right. So So when we say that, again, in our prayers, when we say that verse, what can we be possibly meaning when we're putting it on God first? Or we seem to be putting it on God first.
We must have maltem before we put it on God, I guess.
So David is suggesting there's a context, there's a backstory. We can't just go, from without doing any work. We can't just go to God and say, take us back, and then we'll return. The very act of praying that prayer comes out of our own returning. But we want to hashevota, we want to do it again and again. We need to keep on renewing it. Chadesh yameinu kekedem. We need to keep on refreshing it. I don't do it as much at this computer, but back in the old days, I remember you used to have to refresh things. You had to refresh a page or something like that. So, human beings are the old hardware, where you still have to keep on refreshing a little bit. Yeah, Lynn.
Well, it reminds me very much of the mindfulness, the meditation, the whole. I'm trying to learn to do that for many reasons, but the teachings are all right. The teachings are all, yes, your mind will wander, so you begin again. Yes, these bad things will happen. So the point is that you refresh the page, like you just said. You become mindful of it, and then you do it right, and then you're going to mess up, and then you become mindful of it, and then you start again.
Right, and you don't give up is right. That's the whole thing. Right? And that's the Somech Noflim also, that God picks up the people that fall down. Right? We are in this very subtle and hopefully, and hopefully is really an important word, reciprocal relation with God. If we can pick ourselves back up and not lose hope, that's already part of the divine image that's within us, that's giving us the strength to pick ourselves back up. Right? That's the feeling of hope, is a feeling of not being alone. When people lose all hope, right? And that's, unfortunately, tragically, this happens all over the place all the time. When people lose all hope, part of what they're doing is that they're looking around and they're going, it doesn't matter what I do, doesn't matter what I try to do. Nobody's out there to give me a leg up. Nobody's out there to give me a hand. It's not going to work. And the isolation is, excruciating. Hope is predicated on feeling that you're not by yourself. Hope is because nobody can do everything by themselves. Hope is feeling, if I work on this, something is going to come through. Somebody's going to respond. I'm going to get a break. I'm going to be able to then move to the next step and do X, Y, Z. It's never an isolation fantasy. That's real hope. I mean, people can have all kinds of weird fantasies, but true hope is about believing that there's more out there than just me. For the sake of my own values, other people are going to be out there pulling for it. For the sake of my own desires, there's going to be somebody else out there that's going to reciprocate my desire. I'll find that person. I'll find that cause. I'll find that group. I'll find that opportunity. And that's where God comes in. God is there, right? Psalm 23 is about that, right? That's the Lord is my shepherd, therefore I lack nothing. God is tending me. God is like a sheep in a flock. God is watching over. God is making sure I don't, walk over to the wrong, cliff and fall off the cliff. God is taking me, into the right path, right? And Psalm 27 is about that also, right? God is my light, so I don't have to be afraid. I don't have to be despondent. So this is the mutual kind of feedback system, where if we search out and reach out for God, then God will be bringing us in, right? It's like if somebody is drowning, and the person in the lifeboat reaches their arm out. If you don't reach your arm out to the person who's reaching their arm out, they're not going to be able to get you. So, although sometimes even that happens. So let's look just for a half a second. We have a little bit of time. Let's look at let's read 8 and 9 again.
All right. You, however, will again heed
8, 9, and 10. What the heck?
8, 9, and 10. All right. You, however, will again heed the Lord and obey all his commandments that I enjoin upon you this day. And the Lord your God will grant you abounding prosperity in all your undertakings, in the issue of your womb, the offspring of your cattle, and the produce of your soil. For the Lord will again delight in your well-being, as he did in that of your fathers. Since you will be...
Go ahead. I said 10. Go ahead.
Since you will be heeding the Lord your God and keeping his commandments and laws that are recorded in this book of the teaching, once you return to the Lord your God with all your heart and soul.
All your heart and all your soul. There it is again and again and again. But there's this wonderful phrase there that kasher ki yashuv Hashem lasus alecha letov kasher sas alavotecha. God will once again delight, be so happy to be good with you as God took delight with your ancestors. And this is also a Deuteronomy factor. This is the heart business. This is emotional stuff. To start talking about God being so happy to be, I don't want to be the mean parent that tells you to go to your room, and you can't, do, whatever it is that you want to do. You can't eat that extra piece of ice cream. I want to be the parent that says, here, have another piece of ice cream, have another, let's go for, let's go to the movies together. Let's have fun. This is an image that you have got. God really would love to just have fun with you. God would really be so happy to be able to be happy with you. Right? So this is the image that we have here. All right.
What's the name of this parsha again?
Nitzavim.
Parashat Tshuva. What did you call it?
Yeah, this is Parashat HaTshuva. This particular set of verses, the first 10 verses of chapter 30, is its own parsha. Right? It's in the Torah. It exists as a freestanding parsha.
1 through 10.
Right. Okay. Sei gesund and stark and all.
Thank you,
everybody. And that's the end of the record. Oh, by the